Welcome to the 6th edition of the Middle Eastern Islamic History series. Today we're going to focus on the early Abbasid Caliphate and Persianization. The Abbasid Caliphate is something that we're going to be discussing for the next two lectures, this one and the one following, because it's a caliphate that spans 500 years. But the majority of that time period is going to be taken up by a number of other empires. So we'll start with the Abbasids, and then we'll start to see how they begin to lose power over their large-scale empire and begin to have a number of what are called mawali. We'll discuss this more in depth. Take on aspects of their empire. But, and everybody's favorite part, we have the rules. So what are the rules? This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in any of the fields that we're going to be talking about. I'm not a historian, religious scholar, sociologist. This is going to be a secular presentation. It's going to be from the perspective of what historians and other officials may say. It may differ in certain respects from religious interpretations of those events. Obviously, what's important here is being respectful of others' opinions, especially because of the quasi-religious nature of the discussion. People tend to get very emotionally attached to things. But of course, this is an interactive seminar. So please ask questions, make comments, clarify things, so that way we can all learn more together. As I've said before, this class is a 101 and a 201, meaning that I'll cover the basics if you don't know anything, but if you do know a bit, this will definitely reach a little bit deeper. So everybody can walk away with more information. And of course, this is recorded. So if you miss something or you're not able to make one session, you can always watch it later on the internet. And so we're going to begin with everybody's real favorite part, the quiz, to see what people remembered from last time. So question number 1. Which of the following represents the reaction to Yazid ibn Muawiyah's appointment to the caliphate?
C, I believe, isn't it?
That's exactly right. C is the correct answer, right? Husayn ibn Ali and Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr objected to his being chosen and at different points tried to fight him, right? Husayn ibn Ali was attacked in Karbala by forces loyal to Yazid and defeated before he could rally troops. And Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr actually created a counter-caliphate to oppose Yazid ibn Muawiyah, but was defeated by Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan and his generals. To the other ones, the Arabs did not consider it desirable to aspire to the monarchies. It ended up happening, but it was not widely desired. Hassan ibn Ali stayed largely out of politics after ceding the caliphate to Muawiyah, so he would not have been praising Yazid's military failure at Constantinople. And Yazid ibn Muawiyah was not a wali, he was appointed to the caliphate. And yeah, so okay, question number 2. Mukhtar al-Thaqafi and Zayd ibn Ali ibn Husayn were both famous because of which defining characteristic?
Would this be D?
Yeah, it's D. Howard.
Ali sounds like a Shiite.
Well, yeah. Zayd ibn, this Ali is actually the grandson of the other Ali that you're thinking of, but it's the same line, right? So Zayd is actually Muhammad's great-great-grandson. Yeah, Howard getting 2 for 2. So Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, we studied him. He fought during the rebellion of al-Zubayr, and he fought in Iraq to try and resuscitate the Alid forces, the Shiite forces. He was defeated by al-Zubayr, but he was rebelling based on the Shiite political grievance in Iraq. And again, Zayd was based in Iraq, also the city of Kufa, and he was considered one of the possible candidates for the 5th Imam. And he rose up to challenge the Umayyad system under Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, and he was defeated by that same Umayyad caliph. The rest of them, it's true that there were generals during the Umayyad period, who presided over the Maghreb conquest and the Iberian invasion. It just wasn't these two individuals. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan did build the Dome of the Rock, but he didn't use these two individuals. And Hisham ibn Abdul Malik did create a number of schools, but again, these people did not teach it. All right, question number 3. Which of the following characteristics indicate things that the Umayyads did that the Rashidun Caliphate did not do? Choose all that apply.
B is right? B.
All right, B is one of the answers, yeah.
Is it? Oh, okay. I would have said it was wrong. I thought the Rashidun Caliphate is the one in Spain, right?
The Rashidun Caliphate was the first 4 caliphs, right? Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali.
Ah, okay. Okay, now it makes sense.
So D, does it D also, right? So far we have
I like B.
B,
How about E?
E, I'm sorry, the game patrons.
Well, I think D and E work, don't they?
Exactly, it's B and E, right?
Right.
And C also, right? Because A and D are things that we associate more with the Rashidun Caliphate and less with the Umayyad Caliphate, right? B, C, and E are things that we associate more with the Umayyads and less with the Rashidun Caliphate. We see a shift in the empire between it being one that's based on some sort of the creation of an Islamic religious utopia to one that is based more on the imperial models of the Byzantines and the Sassanids that had preceded them, creating support for arts and education, creating nepotistic appointment structures and bureaucracies, building large palaces and castles. We see the Umayyads taking on the appearance of a pre-existing empire as opposed to some sort of more even governed Rashidun Caliphate. All right, question number 4. Which statement accurately reflects how the Maghreb became part of the Umayyad Caliphate?
I'm trying for A.
Yeah, A is the right answer. So Carthage was actually the ruling city of the Byzantines in North Africa. It was called the Exarchate of North Africa, right? We saw that before, that the Byzantine Empire was sort of split into these exarchates. And the Exarchate of North Africa was based in Carthage. And Abdul Malik ibn Marwan launched an attack on Carthage in the late 690s and leveled it to the ground and instead built Tunis, right, which is the current capital of Tunisia, to govern the area. And Muslims have been trying to take that territory for over 60 years at that point. For over 50 years at that point. So ever since 647. So the Muslims kept invading. They would be pushed back. There would be one of the civil wars, and they'd have to come back. So answer B is just wrong. The Arabs and the Amazigh only really unified forces once the Byzantine aligned Amazigh were killed off. Husayn and Tahir were the leaders of the Amazigh. They were very much opposed to Islam, so they were not du'ad, they were not Muslim evangelists. And the answer D, Tariq ibn Ziyad, and his defeat and his victory at the Battle of Guadalete is about the conquest of Spain, not about the conquest of North Africa. All right, the last question. Which of the following represent successful Umayyad military campaigns?
So many apply? Well, definitely a B.
Okay, B is one.
B sounds likely. A and D definitely are defeats.
A and D, yes, are defeats. That's correct.
B, they attacked Sicily. Did they capture it in 740? I thought that was a little early.
Yeah, that's correct. And that was too early. They made some headway on the island, but they were eventually forced off.
I saw
My favorite battle, guys.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to answer, Aaron.
I know. I didn't want to. I was trying to
Which
hint
one,
people.
the Taurus or the Sicily?
No. Talus and
Oh,
Tours.
yeah.
The TNT. I want to start a bar called TNT. Talus and Tours.
So anyway, Abu
Oh,
Muslim.
you know, there's this interesting fact about the croissant. I don't know if you ever heard of that. That the reason when the Arabs were stopped, that's why French are eating croissant, because to commemorate they're eating the flag of the the Arabs that invaded.
I think that story is actually the Austrians against the Ottomans, because the Ottomans actually used the crescent as their symbol. The Umayyads did not. The Umayyads used a black flag.
Yeah,
Actually,
and that's why ISIS uses the black flag,
yeah.
because they have their fantasy around, the invasion 1,300 years ago. So
Yeah.
And was Charles Martel literate enough to understand a joke like that? And he's the guy that won the Battle of Tours.
Right, exactly. Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi is the Arab general, the Umayyad general, who lost and was killed in the battle. So obviously he lost it.
I think Charles Martel's grandson, it was Charlemagne is the one that
Yeah.
actually learned to read and write.
absolutely, yep,
That
that's
was
correct.
sometime later.
So the a note on F is that Abu Muslim was himself part of the Abbasid dynasty, but as we said last time, he was really pulling on a number of alliances and conquered territories that had become conquered because of the Umayyads. So although he was living in the Abbasid period by 1 or 2 years, and he was himself aligned with the Abbasids as opposed to the Umayyads, in many ways his victory at the Battle of Talas would not have happened if not for all the Umayyad setup that got him there.
Yeah, he was almost like General Dotson of the Northern Alliance. He had this he was a proxy of a proxy of a proxy.
Exactly right. All right, so now
Throwing a little Afghan love for the conversation today.
Yeah. Thoughts and prayers, right? So now we remember before the Islamic conquest that the Arab Empire was this very small thing in Arabia, right? This is when Abu Bakr ascends to the Rashidun Caliphate. Then you have that civil war, which crystallizes the beginning of Shiism as a political doctrine, right? The support of Ali and Ali's family. We also see the beginning in this conflict of the Khawarij, or the external group, right? The Khawarij reject both the Sunni, who make up the majority, and their opinion about who should be caliph, and they reject the Shiite opinion that it should belong to Ali or his descendants, right? The Sunni opinion is that it belongs to somebody in the tribe of Quraysh, which is Muhammad's tribe, but that's a huge group of different people, right? The Shiites believe it has to be narrowly the descendants of Ali, and the Khawarij say that both of these groups are thoroughly discredited, and only a person who's pure of spirit can be the one who runs the caliphate. And the Khawarij are incredibly extreme. We discussed how throughout the Umayyad Caliphate they were subject to repeated repression, and starting the Abbasid Caliphate, we're going to see that they're still a force to be reckoned with, but they're much weaker than they were during the Umayyad period. And so when we concluded the Umayyad period, we saw the Umayyad Empire expanding all the way to the borders of China, the borders of India, and the borders of France, right? You have this empire that controls an incredibly large size of land area. I think it's the 10th largest land empire in history. And as people have pointed out, they controlled the the Silk Road and the spice routes from east to west. And this was the setup for when the Abbasids came in. So one other thing that we need to discuss and recrystallize here is this concept of Mawali. Now, Mawali are people who converted to Islam, or they're the sons of Muslims, sons and daughters of Muslims, but these are not Arabs, right? These are people who converted to Islam. Now, according to Islam as a religious doctrine, there's no distinction to be made between a person of one ethnicity and another ethnicity. All Muslims are the same under God. However, as a functional matter in the empires, this was not the case. So you had a constant stream of what is called Arabization, where people began to dress in an Arab fashion, speak Arabic as their mother tongue, and profess Islam as their religion, and they would become Arab. They would be seen as Arab. This process in Arabic is called ta'rib, right? Arabization. So the Mawali are people who did not Arabize. And it may be that they didn't Arabize in this generation and they would Arabize in the next generation. It could be that they wouldn't Arabize ever, right? There are a lot of people who are ethnic Amazigh, ethnic Egyptian, ethnic Turk, who have Arabized, or ethnic Persian, who have Arabized over successive generations. But prior to that Arabization process, they were considered Mawali. They were non-Arab Muslims. And they are subdivided into all these different groups. Probably the most important ones to look at today are the two Turkic groups. So we have the Ghulam or Mamluk, and the Ghulam or Mamluk is a Turkish slave soldier. Now the Arab empires, starting in this period, have three different slave trades, and we're going to discuss them more in detail. But one of these three is that they bought and sold Turkish slaves from Central Asia to work as soldiers. They were conscripted into the armies, and the armies eventually shifted from being majority Arab Muslim armies to being majority Mamluk armies. At the same time, you also have free Turks, Turks who were not brought into the empire through this slave system, but because the empire had expanded into Central Asia, there were a number of Turkic tribes that became part and parcel of the Abbasid Caliphate, including the Oghuz and Turgesh and Karluks, and there were a number of different Turkic tribes. But most of them, until about the year 1000, and we're going to discuss that next time, stay in Central Asia and don't make their way to the rest of the empire. We're also going to see probably the most important Mawali group from the perspective of the Abbasids, which are the Persians, right? We discussed previously how you had these Dikhan, these landed nobility in the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire that preceded Islamic conquest, and these Dikhan had an incredible amount of control over the territory, as well as an educated bureaucracy behind them. So that became an incredible focus and weight in the empire because of that level of engagement that they could provide the caliph. And of course, we shouldn't forget the Amazigh, who were leading the conquest of Spain, or the Egyptians, who were increasingly Arabizing during this period, but were responsible for the Abbasid navy. Okay. So one of the things I want to point out now is if we remember that Umayyad map, right? That Umayyad map included Spain, included Morocco and Algeria, and extended all the way to China. One of the things that you'll start to see with the Abbasid map is that it contracts. And it contracts quite severely as we move through time, right? So this was in the year 800. By the year 900, the Abbasids have lost Egypt. They have a very small area in northern Africa. They've lost most of Persia, and they're only really in the Middle East. By the year 950, you can't even see them on the map, right? And this is important because most people point out that the Abbasid Caliphate was finally overthrown in the year 1258, which is strange because they're not on the map, and it's only 950. The thing is that we're going to notice the Abbasid Caliphate loses power until the point that it is simply a city-state in Baghdad. And we're going to go over the causes of that, but it's important to keep in memory that the Abbasids inherited this massive empire from the Umayyads, and they kept losing territory even as they were growing in terms of their culture, development, and psychology. Any questions before I move into economics?
Oh, yeah. I have a question. I think, okay. Umayyad, okay. You said it's disappear in the year 1000. I don't get it, you know.
No. Okay. This is the Umayyad Empire, right? The Umayyad Empire, the Caliphate, falls in the year 749, 750. We're going to discuss that more in detail in a little bit.
Okay.
But the transition of power is actually very similar, you can imagine, to the transition of power in China. right? One dynasty is replaced by another dynasty. They inherit all of the same lands.
Mhm.
This is what happens here. So the Abbasids inherit this vast territory, the Umayyads, and then they proceed to lose it.
Oh, okay.
So this is a huge difference between the Abbasids and the Umayyads, right? The Umayyads started with a smaller empire, and they kept pushing the boundaries, right? They conquered northern Africa, they conquered Spain, they conquered Central Asia, they pushed further north into the Caucasus region. They tried to take Constantinople twice, right? We have this attempt to expand the empire, and we don't really see that from the Abbasids. The Abbasids seem to be losing their territory as time goes on. All right. In terms of economics, as we mentioned before, slavery becomes a massive institution during the Abbasid Caliphate period. Not that it didn't exist during the Umayyad period, but it becomes significantly bigger in the Abbasid period. The first major influx is the discovery of an island off the coast of Tanzania that the Arabs begin to call Zanzibar, which is Persian for the island of the blacks, right? In English, we call this island Zanzibar. So Zanzibar became a hub for the trading of black slaves up and down the coast of Africa. That trade extended throughout the Swahili, which is the area where the Swahili live, along the coast of Tanzania, Kenya, and Somalia. Those areas became prime ports for the exportation of slaves, black slaves, to the Islamic Empire. The height of the slave trade in the Islamic world was in the 900s to about 1100. But the slave trade in the Islamic world did not die down completely to zero until the 20th century. Now, this network of black slaves has.
Did you say 20th century?
Yes, there were still slaves in. There was still a slave trade going to Saudi Arabia in the 1960s.
Yeah, and it wasn't until really the 60s that the final states outlawed it, even amongst their own definition of Islamic law. So
yeah, there are two defining characteristics of the Zanj, or black slavery, right? The Zanj slavery. The first one is that the Zanj were primarily used in agricultural positions or as domestic slaves. And the second one is that we see the exact opposite numbers that we would expect from the American situation of black slavery, which was in many ways implemented very similarly. And what I mean by the backwards numbers is that when it came to importation to the Americas, the importation rate was about 2.5 to 2.75 males per female, right? And the reason for this is rather straightforward. The men could work the cotton fields more effectively than the women could, so there was a greater desire for the men. Because cotton, sugarcane, tobacco, those were the cash crops. You needed men who could work them.
But the women can have babies and they can be slaves, so they produce slaves.
Right, so it's not zero, right? It's not that they only wanted men, but they wanted 2.5 to 2.75 men for every woman they wanted. In the Arab world, we see the opposite. We see somewhere between 2.5 and 2.75 women desired for every man taken. And this is probably because, with the exception of Iraq's massive cotton plantations, the Arab world does not have the kind of waterlogged areas that can give rise to massive sugar growth or cotton, or there's also the Nile Valley, you can grow cotton, but it's a very thin area. Aside from those two areas, you really didn't have the kind of plantation slavery that we did in the Americas. So domestic slavery was much more desirable. And that's why we see many more women than men. We also see large-scale castration of the men. The idea is that you would always import more rather than have the possibility of a male slave otherwise impregnating his host or his master.
It's interesting, Rich, that when I went to Istanbul, the Sultan Palace, Topkapi, where he had a women harem was guarded by slaves that were castrated. That's what was an interesting fact about it.
Yes, but the slaves who were guarding the harem were generally willing castrate. They're a different type of slave called sakaliba. We'll get into that. But the Zanj who were castrated were not usually in charge of managing harems. They were given a lesser duty. And to the extent that we understand Arab literature from the 700s, 800s, and 900s, it's clear that racism did exist in the Arab world. Blacks were treated in a different way than Arabs and other light-skinned people, including between slaves. And we have poetry written by Blacks from the time who talk about the color of their skin in a fashion that would lead you to believe that they were the subject of racial prejudice. Things like, my skin may be black, but my heart is white. Something like this.
You have to justify your, what you
Your
are doing.
circumstance. Yeah.
Right, but
Yeah.
you could easily justify it through non-racial means, right? You could say the Zanj were not practicing Muslims, right? Which is why it was permissible to enslave them, right? They're not practicing Muslims, therefore they should be treated badly, right? Like you could make this argument, but that's not the argument that it appears was made. There appears to be made a very similar argument to the one that we see among Europeans, let's say 700, 800 years later, which is that blacks have some sort of bestial quality, that they're somehow subhuman, and that this justifies their lower ranked treatment.
Yeah. The other piece also is the death rate for males was astronomically higher. I don't know if you want to get into that at all, Richard.
Sure. There are two reasons why the death rate for men was very high. Number one, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the Zanj revolts, the way that they were overworked in the Arab world was significantly worse than the way that they were overworked in the Americas. Now, the numbers are fewer, right? The size of the plantations in Iraq does not compare to the size of the plantations in Brazil, for example. Like, it's just, we're talking orders of magnitude. But the slaves that were there were overworked to the point of death. It's very similar, in fact, if we look at the statistics, to the way the Taino people of the Caribbean were overworked to death, right? Columbus shows up in Hispaniola, within a decade, half the population is dead.
Rich, but that was also in the States they were producing cotton, in Brazil there was sugarcane, so it was a different time of exploitation too.
Sure, but
Yeah.
the point that I'm making is that the level of harshness of the work, the overwork that leads to death, starvation, dehydration, we see that in the Americas. We see that much more poignantly and much more stringently during the Abbasid years. Like Arab historians comment on how harsh the treatment is, and they can't even stomach it. That they're ashamed of their fellow Arabs.
Do we know when they started this idea that, or this thing that blacks were, not humans and all that? I mean, where did it start?
We don't have an exact date, right? But and it's also not
Or place. I mean,
no. It's also not a switch, right? It's not like one day blacks are human and the next day they're subhuman. There are slow implementations of ideas. So we have writings from the early 700s that show that there's at least some conception of blacks being subhuman, right? But it's not articulated in that language. Something like a black slave on the market is worth less than a sakalib, a white slave is worth less than a sakalib, even though they have the same proportions, right? In the ledger, they're just worth less. Or you'll have somebody writing something like, I saw a black on the side of the road, but like he'd write that in a way that he wouldn't write, I saw an Arab on the side of the road. Like it just wouldn't be the same verbiage. So you start to see these kinds of differences in the beginning of the 700s through to the 800s and 900s.
Yeah, because, well, I was going to make 2 points. At some point, the Athens sent troops to Sparta to help them put down a Helot revolt. And the Athenians were really disturbed to see Greek-speaking slaves. It was understood in Greece that you could enslave barbarians all you wanted, but you had to treat Greeks with respect. It was something that bothered. The other thing is the treatment of slaves in southern US in the first half of the 19th century was based on the fact that they didn't like importing slaves from Africa. Sometimes they were dangerous, and the slave trade was being cut off. So slaves were extremely valuable. They were worth many, many years of a laborer's salary sort of thing. If you have a supply, in a sense, you can mistreat slaves if they're cheap and you can replace them easily. So the conditions in the Caribbean were bad. The conditions, but we go back to the 18th century, the slaves were a lot more replaceable and expendable, and the conditions would be a lot worse. And if you move away from, particularly move to Brazil.
But that was because the type of work they did. I mean,
Well, the type of work
sugarcane
is a
is
factor, but
different.
you've got,
Sugarcane,
is
they were dead and they keep replanting them.
in
And
the southern
in
US, in the 19th century, your slave is worth $1,000. That's a hell of a lot of money even now. That's a hell of a lot of money back then.
Yeah,
so
and
you took good
also
care
they
of them.
can reproduce, but in the Caribbean, they will keep bringing
Well, the
new
Caribbean
ones.
was different.
Yeah,
And I
because,
find prior to the
because-
19th century, it was different too.
Yeah. No, but I just
because the crop was different, not because
No, it's
the
because
people.
these slaves were valuable, so you took good care of them.
You mentioned these slaves are from the coast of Africa. You are talking about from the Madagascar or talking about from the Mozambique?
I'm talking about even further north than Mozambique, right? The island is Zanzibar, which is a small island.
Oh, Zanzibar. So they are from Zanzibar, not the big island, the small island next to the Tanzania, Zanzibar, right?
That's where they're being traded from, but the Africans are being captured further inland, right?
Oh, yeah, I got you. Yeah, Zanzibar, that's the place. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, and the reason it's called Zanzibar, right, in English, is that it's an English rendering of Zanj Ibar, which is in Persian, the island of the Zanj, the island of the blacks, right? Because that's how the Arabs came to know it.
Okay.
All right, so we have one of the three categories of slaves. We've talked about the Zanj. The next category of the slaves that we're going to talk about, I didn't have a good picture of it, and these are the Sakailiba. And the Sakailiba are white slaves. So you had pirate ships that were going through the Mediterranean and kidnapping people on the southern coast of what's now France, on the southern coast of what's now the Balkans, and also trading with people, for example, like the Kievan Rus, to buy white slaves. Now, white slaves were typically treated better. They were almost always domestic servants. The one exception is that in Spain, Sakailiba were almost always used militarily, slave soldiers, and the Sakailiba were generally integrated into administrative structures in the rest of the empire. And the third type of slave is the Mamluk, right? These are the slaves from Central Asia. These are Turkic slave soldiers, and they come to be the majority of the fighting force as we move through the Abbasid Caliphate. It's also worth noting that in addition to the slave economy, which was incredibly prosperous, we also see large-scale production and imports throughout the Arab world. So we have the printing of lots of money. We've even found Abbasid coins as far north as Sweden, which shows you how far the trade really expanded. So to get back to the more linear history, so we had our Umayyads, and in 746, Abu Muslim, who was gathering his forces to fight the Chinese at the Battle of Talas in 751, is also working with Abu al-Abbas as-Safa. And Abu al-Abbas is from this Abbasid family. The Abbasids are part of the Banu Hashim clan, right? That's the same clan as Muhammad. And they capitalize on a large amount of discontent in the Persian side of the Umayyad Empire, right? We mentioned that the Persians are Mawali, but they're Mawali with a large-scale aristocratic and gubernatorial ability. And they felt like they weren't being treated as equals under the Umayyad government because the Umayyad government had a pro-Arab policy. Abu al-Abbas capitalized on this and made an army of Persians and Persian-aligned individuals in the eastern part of the caliphate. So while Abu Muslim was gathering his forces to make the siege against the Chinese, Abu al-Abbas moved towards Kufa and staked his claim to be caliph. After he defeated Marwan II, he then invited all of the Umayyad princes to a large dinner. So you can see the dinner in the upper left-hand side, sort of recreated. Obviously, this is an actual normal feast. It's not a recreation of the event, but that's what it would have looked like, right? Lots of food, lots of merriment, and then as the first course was served, the Abu al-Abbas clubbed all of the Umayyad princes to death, all of them save one, who escaped. And in fact, that's how he got his name, As-Safa, which means the bloodshedder. After he killed all the Umayyad princes, except for the one that fled to Spain, he declared himself as the new caliph and received homage from all of the different quarters of the caliphate. There was no insurrection against him. He was able to unify the remainder of the caliphate under his authority. All right. So, but he wasn't really the one who designed the Abbasid Caliphate, right? Because he only ruled for about 4 to 5 years. The person who's really responsible for that was his brother, Al-Mansur, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. Al-Mansur means the victorious one. And he took that title because of his victory in a number of different military campaigns. But it's important here to point out all the ways that he really improved or developed or shaped the Abbasid Caliphate. The first one is that we remember this general Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. That was the one who won the Battle of Talas. He was very famous after that victory and was very popular as well. So Abu Ja'far al-Mansur couldn't allow somebody who is that popular to begin to get support behind him and perhaps make a run at the caliphate. So this became a very sort of Saul-David situation for those who know the Bible well, where you have a king who simply inherited power, and you have a general with astounding military victories behind him and good alliances. So Abu Ja'far invited Abu Muslim to meet him, and at his signal, he had 4 men come out from different sides and all stab Abu Muslim al-Khurasani to kill him. This was seen very negatively, of course, by the wider public, who really respected Abu Muslim al-Khurasani, but it prevented any threat to al-Mansur's rule. He also began the process of building a new capital city. Now, as we remember, the Umayyads ruled from Damascus, and there was still strong pull for the Banu Umayyah family in Damascus, so it wouldn't make sense to build a capital there. Now, the Banu Umayyah, who were not Umayyads themselves, were still loyal to the Abbas, right? They gave their loyalty to the Abbasids, but it was still not a smart play to put your capital in the territory of your historical opponents. And considering that their greatest support came from the Persians, they decided to build their capital closer to where the historic Persian capital of Ctesiphon had been, which is why they built Baghdad. And Baghdad was built on the Tigris River in a large circle. And it was supposed to be a utopian city for Muslim governance. Jason, do you have a question?
Yeah, that's a side question. And what's the Abu means? Look, guys have a lot of people named Abu something.
Oh, Abu means father.
Father.
But it's very common that somebody will be called Abu Ja'far. Like, for example, Abu Ja'far. It means that his son was named Ja'far, so he's called Abu Ja'far. He's the father of Ja'far. But like,
so he has the name before. So so that means my father, after my father have me, my father changed his name to Abu Jason, something like this.
Yeah, your father would call himself Abu Jason. Yeah.
So he get the name after he have me, not before he has me.
Yeah, yeah. And like a lot. This is something that's very typical in pre-modern societies. Is that oftentimes your name is in relation to somebody else who is alive. So, yeah, this construction Abu Ja'far, the father of Ja'far.
So after I have my son Thomas, so my name will become Abu Thomas, something like this.
It could be.
In Taiwan, the Aboriginal tribe, they have this kind of naming system, you know.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's the government forbid it because it's too confusing, you know, it doesn't work. So
yeah. No, it's not a modern system. Today, Arabs don't name themselves this way. They'll name themselves X, son of Y, tribe.
The other thing also to recognize about al-Khorasani is that that's what the ISIS of Afghanistan associates themselves with. Basically, they call it ISIS-K, and the K is for Khorasan, and you know, it is all of their kind of creation myth ties back to this period, basically.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah, Khorasani is the person of Khorasan, right? That's the E is just an adjectival suffix. So he is from Khorasan. That's how we got that name. And Khorasan is that eastern region of Iran, which today composes Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, the western part of Central Asia. So it would make absolute sense that Islamic State, to the extent that it exists in Afghanistan, would call themselves Khorasan. Now, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur also began the process of building a great store of knowledge. He began the translation project. Right, he's not the one that's best remembered for it, but he started it. And the first text that he wanted to translate was Zanj al-Hind, which is actually an Indian treatise. It's the one that looks like it's a plus sign with all those quadrants, and it's a star map with key information about how astronomy affects our world. But he didn't just stop there. He also began to translate Greek texts. So you have the Almagest of Ptolemy on the right-hand side, which he also had translated. Al-Mansur was also presiding over one of the most pivotal points in the creation of both modern Sunni Islam and modern Shiite Islam. How they sort of broke away from the historical versions in the Umayyad Caliphate. And one of these ways was that you started having what were called the school leaders. Now, Sunni Islam, which is the majority of all Muslims in the world, breaks down into 4 different schools. These schools are differentiating themselves over very minor things. For example, how many water ablutions you need to do before you pray. Like a good Christian example would be whether you cross yourself with 3 fingers or 2 fingers, right? This huge debate in Orthodox Christianity of whether you cross yourself with 3 fingers or 2 fingers. So, right, the Islamic example: do you do 3 ablutions or 2 ablutions? Do you pray, 5 distinct times per day, or do you pray 2 times together, and 1 time apart? So it's a total of 5. There's all these different small discrepancies, but these fall under the schools of jurisprudence. And 2 of the schools of jurisprudence really developed during this time. The most common one is the Hanafi school, led by Abu Hanifa. And the Hanafi school is really popular in the Middle East. You also have the Maliki school that develops, and the Maliki school is very popular in Western Africa and Northwest Africa. Abu Hanifa was sought by al-Mansur as a source of wisdom, and he decided that he wanted to make him the Qadi al-Qudat, meaning the Supreme Court judge, right? The Qadi al-Qudat. And Abu Hanifa refused because he considered al-Mansur to be somebody who was not righteous, and therefore he wouldn't give his services to him. Accordingly, al-Mansur decided to demonstrate how not righteous he was by imprisoning Abu Hanifa and eventually poisoning him. During al-Mansur's reign, also Malik ibn Anas, the founder of the Maliki school, was arrested in what's now Saudi Arabia and flogged repeatedly. In this case, though, it appears that al-Mansur did not order this punishment, and he actually punished the governor of Hijaz, that region of Saudi Arabia, for engaging in the flogging. But it meant that Malik ibn Anas had difficulty spreading his doctrine afterwards. And finally, on the Shiite side, we've talked before about how there were 5 Shiite imams, right? The 5th one being either Zayd ibn Ali, right, the one who led that revolt, or his brother, Muhammad al-Baqir. So the majority of Shiites follow Muhammad al-Baqir as the 5th imam. Then came the 6th imam, Ja'far al-Sadiq. And Ja'far al-Sadiq, or also known as Ja'far the Righteous, was an incredibly popular person. And he was liked by both Sunnis and Shiites, although he was clearly a Shiite claimant. He was arrested and killed by al-Mansur, and he was then buried in this tomb called al-Baqiya in Saudi Arabia. In 1926, because of the revolutions that were going on in Saudi Arabia at the time, this tomb, along with a number of other grave sites in Saudi Arabia, was destroyed. So this tomb no longer exists. This is a picture from before 1926. It's one of the few remaining pictures we have on the al-Baqiya tomb, where Ja'far al-Sadiq was buried. And so these 3 individuals, Abu Hanifa, Malik ibn Anas, and Ja'far al-Sadiq, really crystallized the beginnings of what we would say is the modern views of Sunni Islam on the Hanafi and Maliki side, and the beginning of the split between the Seveners, right, the Ismailis, and the Twelvers, or the most dominant form of Shiism that we have today, especially in Iran. All right. After al-Mansur, we move to the next important caliph of the Abbasids, who was Harun al-Rashid, or Aaron the Righteous. And Harun al-Rashid really built a number of diplomatic relationships. Probably the most important diplomatic relationship he built was with Charlemagne. He sent Charlemagne a water clock and numerous other gifts that astounded Europeans at the time. In return, he managed to get an alliance with the Franks, especially against the Umayyads, right? Because the Umayyads were in Spain. Having a strong alliance against them was key. He also built the Bayt al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. And that was where a lot of the translated folios, especially starting from al-Mansur, would be kept. And he funneled even more money into the translation project. Finally, he had a number of confrontations with the Byzantine Empire. In one of them, he got to the edge of Constantinople and brought back a train of 20,000 donkeys worth of loot. So I decided to bring those donkeys over there to show how wealthy he was in terms of plundering the Byzantines. There's actually a few things worth noting here. The first one, as Howard points out, is that they called France Frangistan. Frange was their word for Frank. So Frangistan was the land of the Franks. Probably another thing worth mentioning is that Harun al-Rashid also saw the largest loss of territory in the Abbasid period. He lost Morocco, he lost Algeria in significant measure. He lost Tunisia as well to the Idrisids, Tahirids, and Aghlabids, respectively. And he had to deal with a number of rebellions and revolts throughout his territory while he was in power. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that because of Harun al-Rashid's love of literature and wisdom, his building of the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, he has become a pivotal character in 1001 Arabian Nights. And so in much of the Arab world, his mythological stature far outpaces his actual historical deeds. So one of the things that's important to point out here is that because of the Bayt al-Hikmah and because of investment in the Persian bureaucratic structure, which the Abbasids absolutely did do, you see a large amount of research into science, philosophy, mathematics, and these are some of the individuals who lived during this period, during the Abbasid period, who began to work on these disciplines. So you have, for example, Ibn al-Haytham, who was a polymath who spent the majority of his time working on optics. You have Ibn Sina and al-Razi, who were both premier doctors and medical analysts. You have al-Kindi, who was responsible for chemistry, and also early philosophy. So you had this blooming of intelligence and development that occurred during the Abbasid rule. You also have a lot of music that develops during this time. We have these three are my personal favorite instruments. You have the oud, which is the ancestor of the lute and the guitar. You have the kanun, which was an ancient Persian instrument, but became more acculturated into Arab music during this period. The kanun is also called like the zither. And then you have the flute or the ney, that was typically made out of wood with a reed at the mouth. And you can see in the image on the right-hand side from a Persian miniature of courtiers playing all of these instruments. There was a lot of art and music during this period, and that's why it's often called the Golden Age. All right. After Harun al-Rashid came Caliph Ma'mun, and Caliph Ma'mun began what was called the Mihna, or the Islamic Inquisition. Now, one of the things that have been developing in philosophy at this point was the idea of Mu'tazila, or the idea that everything in the Quran could be explained rationally, that there was a rational understanding of religion that could follow. And these Mu'tazilites managed to start their own Inquisition, or Mihna, to persecute those who refused to ascribe to the rationalist views that they hold. And one of these views was on the question of Quranic createdness. So the Mu'tazilites believed that the Quran was a document that existed because God willed it into existence at a certain time and place. Now, it could be that the Quran was created in the very revelations to Muhammad, or it could be that the Quran was created sometime after the beginning of all things, right? But either way, in their view, the Quran was created. There were many traditional scholars who rejected this analysis and argued that the Quran was not created, but rather was a part of God, something that was uncreated since the beginning of the universe, because God himself is uncreated since the beginning of the universe. And a number of leaders were persecuted specifically because of this. One of them being Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He was, we mentioned Abu Hanifa and Malik ibn Anas, who were two of the founders of the four schools. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is the founder of the Hanbali school, which is the third of the four schools. The last one is Shafi'i, and he lives in a different time period. So, but Ahmad ibn Hanbal refused to acknowledge the doctrine of createdness, and so he was tortured by the Mihna, by the Inquisition, told to recant his views repeatedly. He refused, and in so doing, he effectively became a martyr. He never died in prison. He died a natural death, but because of how much torture he went through and how he refused to renounce his faith and the uncreatedness of the Quran, he effectively broke the back of the Mu'tazilite movement and got a large-scale popularity behind the view of non-createdness, which is now the dominant position among most Muslims. You can also see that Caliph Ma'mun maintained the diplomatic relations that had been established by Harun al-Rashid, including the Treaty of Surrender that the Byzantines had given to Harun. And so there were emissaries between Caliph Ma'mun and Emperor Theodosius of the Byzantines. All right, so If you thought history was confusing before, well, it's going to get even more confusing. So I decided to write out a few bullet points about what's going to happen now. So we mentioned that there were slave soldiers in the Abbasid Caliphate military. Those slave soldiers, those Mawali, are going to gain increased autonomy, and that autonomy will eventually lead to their independence. We're going to see that the slavery that we talked about becomes even more political. We're going to see that the Abbasid Caliphate moves from a temporal empire, right, one that controls land, people, and territory, to one that is mostly ecclesiastical. Think of the way the Vatican operates today. So we're going to shift between those two situations. We're going to see that the sectarian differences that that already existed are only going to get stronger, and we're going to see that the Levant region, especially as we move into the Crusader period, becomes contested between the Egyptian and Persian powers. But that's more for next week than today. If we look to Mamun's borders, we notice that Mamun did not accede to the caliphate easily. There were a number of Turkish soldiers who refused to support him, and so he had to come in with military force. So he reached out to a Persian noble named Tahir ibn Husayn. And you can see this is actually a picture from a movie series in Turkey, where you can see Caliph Mamun talking to Tahir ibn Husayn to discuss battle tactics, and Tahir was helpful in getting Mamun installed. So Mamun decided to give Tahir authority and allowed him to build a capital city at Merv. Now Tahir created his own small empire, small used facetiously, of course. It was, you can see the Tahirid Empire was the majority of the modern state of Iran, significant parts of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan as well. The Tahirid Empire managed to become semi-autonomous from the Abbasid Caliphate, although although it never actually renounced the Caliphate and remained a vassal state. And Tahir himself was one of these Dikhan, right? We remember the Dikhan from before, these Persian nobles. But this was the first time that the Persians had some degree of self-rule in nearly 150 years. Because Tahir ibn Husayn, although he was nominally loyal to Caliph Mamun, was able to create his own empire. In many ways, even though Tahir was an Arabic speaker, and the majority of his government of Persians were Arabic speakers, the separation of Persia here at this early juncture prevented the large-scale Arabization of Persia, and is one of the reasons why the Persian language still survives, whereas a number of the other languages in the region don't. As we move into the later 800s, after the death of Caliph Mamun, after the failure of the Mihna, you begin to have what's called the Anarchy at Samarra. And this starts because a number of different caliphs come to power, each one supported by the Turkish military garrison, the Mamluk. And so the caliphs end up being locked in this small city of Samarra. You can see what's left of the great tower of Samarra and the mosque that adjoined it. So these, and there would occasionally be a caliph who would try, like al-Mutawakkil, who would try to assert his own authority against these Turkish soldiers, and they would simply kill him or imprison him and then choose a different caliph to stand on the throne. The Turkish soldiers knew that they didn't have the biological pedigree to rule in their own name, but they also knew that they were the true seat of power and that they could control who the caliph would be. It was only when al-Mu'tadid effectively allowed the Turks to rule with his signet that the anarchy at Samarra ended. We also need to talk about the Zanj rebellion. So there were several Zanj rebellions, and as I mentioned, in the lower part of Iraq, it's actually marshy enough to grow large amounts of cotton. You can actually see the marshes in the lower right-hand side of the screen. Those are current marsh Arabs who live there. Those of you who remember the Persian Gulf War of '91, remember that Saddam Hussein actually cut off the marshes. He dammed them up in order to oppress these people. But at that time, you had large-scale Zanj slavery in the southern part of Iraq. And you can see on this map all of these cities that became flare-ups in the Zanj rebellion. Now, the Zanj rebellion was led by a man named Ali ibn Muhammad al-Bahraini. You can see sort of a picture of him in the center here. It's unclear exactly what Ali ibn Muhammad's idea was, or what his ideology was. Most suspect him to be Khawarij. And he also took on the name Sahaba Zanj, or friend of the blacks. And so he stirred up the revolt. But it wasn't just Zanj that fought in the revolt. He also managed to get marsh Arabs and other marginalized groups to fight with him. You eventually had the Arab governments repress this rebellion, and they repressed it to such an extent that, as I mentioned earlier, the historians couldn't believe what they were hearing in terms of the numbers and the bloodiness of the situation. In fact, they may well have been exaggerating in terms of numbers and effect, but it left a very poignant memory in many locals' minds about how the revolt was put down and how violent it was. All right. The next part of the empire to break off actually is Egypt. So in the late 800s, as you have this anarchy at Samarra, you have Ahmad ibn Tulun, who is a Turkish Mamluk, right? One of these slave soldiers. He declares the independence of Egypt as his own personal kingdom, and he creates a capital city, which is Qatai. The city of Qatai doesn't exist anymore. It was razed to the ground after the age of the Tulunids, but the mosque survived, and as Cairo has grown, Qatai has become part of Cairo. But the mosque, as I said, survived. He also was very famous for building what were called Maristan, which is a Persian word referring to hospitals. And so he was responsible for providing large-scale healthcare to the majority of the people in and around Qatai and the other major cities of Egypt. So you can actually see on this map that by the year 900, right, the Tulunids were now in control of Egypt. The Abbasids were losing territory in Iran, and most of North Africa had already defected. So a lot of the territory of the Abbasids was shrinking at the time. On the Persian side, we haven't really discussed what happened since the Tahirids, but the Tahirids had one dynasty. They were replaced by the Safavids. The Safavids were conquered then by the Samanids, and the Samanids then by the Umayyads. The important thing to realize is that each of these empires became more and more connected to the Persian identity, and more and more strongly tried to separate themselves from the prospect of Arabization. The Safavids, for example, were responsible for financing many new Persian manuscripts. So you had all these groups that were increasing the level of Persian language that was being used. To the extent that Mamluk were still part of the army, that was generally reduced. And the level of Arab bureaucracy ended. But that didn't mean that these empires were in any way weak or cut off. In fact, they controlled the majority of the territory of the former Abbasid Caliphate. You can see this map from the year 970. The Salarids, the Buyids, the Saffarids, and the Samanids are all Iranic peoples. The Hamdanids are a small Arab dynasty, and the Fatimids took over from the Tulunids by 970. So, in fact, it was the Buyids who conquered Baghdad, and the Buyids were Shiites. They were Zaydi Shiite, but they were a type of Persian called Daylamite, meaning that they came from the mountains, and they had their own cavalry units. You can see what they look like there. They built numerous buildings of their own, such as the Jurjir Mosque in Isfahan, as they expanded their empire. And as you can see from the map, the area that they controlled started in Fars, that region in southern Iran, where most of the Iranian empires seem to start, and expanded west until they conquered in the area around Baghdad, right? Baghdad being the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. And so the Buyids were effectively in charge now of the comings and goings and choices of the Abbasids, which is strange in that they were Shiite and the Abbasids were Sunni, but they allowed them to continue governing and continuing being the leaders of the Sunni world. At the same time as they were losing territories in the east and the west, the Abbasids tried to expand their sea empire, and they were widely successful in terms of their naval engagements. You had large-scale Arab corsairs in the Mediterranean, conquering territories like Sicily, southern Italy, Crete, and raiding a number of other islands like Corsica or Sardinia. They also raided the southern coast of the Byzantine Empire, and the dead from those fights were buried across those areas. You can see, for example, this is the Turkish cemetery on Malta. Of course, Turks are buried here too, but the Turkish cemetery covers all of the Muslims who died on Malta, which includes several Arab invasions. And during this period, we also have cultural expansion into Africa. So you can see you have the Ghana kingdom, which was founded around 800, and they began trading with Abbasid government officials, as well as the kingdoms of North Africa that had split off from the Abbasids, like the Aghlabids and the Idrisids. And through them, they learned Islam, and Ghana converted to Islam in the mid-900s, as well as they traded salt and gold. Salt came from the northern Sahara deserts, and gold came from the rivers very close to the border with Takur. You also had the expansion of Islam throughout the Sahel region, right? We talked earlier about the slave trade that was going on in the Swahili kingdoms and city-states in Eastern Africa. So you had the penetration of Islamic trade into those areas. And I guess we're running short today because that's all I got.
Excellent presentation, Rich. I have a couple of questions, I guess, and maybe this may not be related. We know that during the trade, when the slaves were transported to Americas, there was some tribes involved actively in enslaving themselves. Like this is purely
the tribes were not enslaving themselves; they were enslaving other African tribes.
Yeah, right. Other tribes enslaved. That's what I meant. And then here you're saying this is just a capturing of slaves, right? This was not, auxiliary help. Any auxiliary help was given her.
No, that's wrong. You have many cases of African tribes enslaving other African tribes to sell them to Arabs. In fact, we were just talking about Africa. With regards to the Tuareg, who are the Amazigh peoples of the desert, we have numerous cases of them enslaving Africans to sell to Arabs. In fact, the Amazigh were some of the last people, the Tuareg were some of the last people to allow abolition of slavery to take place, and that was in 2008.
Right. Because I was always interested, Berbers were obviously, let's just say, not as white as the other Arabs from the Arab Peninsula, and always was interesting. What was the discrimination? And was there any discrimination, even though they were looked at as they took up Muslim religion pretty early?
In terms of other Arabs saw each other pretty much as equals. It was when it came to Africans that there was discrimination. And in the early days of Islam, it wasn't much of an issue. It became much more of an issue during the late Umayyad period and into the Abbasid period.
Right. Interesting. So now, the second question I have, you said you just mentioned music, you mentioned science, you mentioned all this, let's say, just culture and high-end stuff. And as we know, currently, with Taliban, with ISIL, whatever you call it, all of this stuff are, kind of not recognized, or in some cases are not allowed. Were they more progressive at the time? What was happening?
The ideology that the Taliban, Islamic State, they all follow what's called Salafism, which was a movement in 18th century Saudi Arabia that made the argument that the entire history of Islamic doctrine that developed after about the year 700 or so was a failure, was a total failure, and was a failure in the sense that it failed to preserve the values of the first generations of Muslims. What they did is that they, from the point of view of the Salafists, that the other Muslims, what they had been doing was bid'ah, or additions to the doctrine, that they were changing it, modifying and growing it. And so what you needed to do was to return to the source and to the original views, unadulterated by centuries of understanding. And actually, there's a very strong analog with this here in the United States. If you look at the originalist interpretations of the Constitution, right? The originalists on the Supreme Court will say, look, you have all this jurisprudence since 1790 that tries to reinterpret and re-understand and recontextualize and develop the Constitution for the present day. But the Constitution was written in 1789, so it should be understood the way they understood it in 1789. You shouldn't be applying your 1960s civil rights understanding, Chinese Exclusion Act ending view of constitutionality. It's not right. And then the flip side of the process, what the majority of Muslims say and what the majority of legal scholars say in the two parallels is, no, laws develop as an organic historical process as human beings interact with the corpus that they've been given and compare that and contextualize that with their lives and their understanding of reality, right? And so while a distinction may have been important in 1790, it's not important anymore. Or a distinction that wasn't important in 1790 is very important now, and we need to take that seriously. We need to take the world that we live in as part of our analysis of the tradition, right? In the constitutional example, we call it the living constitution, right? It's this idea. And the ideology of the Taliban and of Islamic State and of Al-Qaeda and all these groups is Salafist ideology that is originalist in this intent. And so all of these developments of science and philosophy and music and art and literature, these are all, in their view, expansions based on a misunderstanding of how the divine writ was supposed to be taken.
Interesting.
Right?
So I guess the loaded question right now is, what are you, and then, we cannot not talk about it, but Taliban taking over Kabul, and they're saying they're changing the doctrine where they're going to allow women to go to school, and therefore they're on, and they want public relation with the, international community. So you know, in your opinion or anybody's opinion, that what do you think is happening? Are they recognizing that now they can't move on like this with this 700s, you know, AD, you know?
I honestly think it's smoke and mirrors. I don't think anything is going to change in terms of their governance style. The thing is that they can't afford to just be massively internationally sanctioned again. That's basically what it is. They want to keep the economy functional so that they don't get overthrown by a mass riot. And so so that's what that is. And there are rules that Salafists have for accepting momentary lapses in religious law, so that way you can make a treaty with an unbeliever, right? Which is what the UN is in their view, right? The UN is unbelievers. So I don't see it as anything more than them trying to do the bare minimum so they don't get massive sanctions.
I see. Interesting. All right. I guess anybody else has any questions or want to ask Rich a question or add something? No. Go ahead.
I want to thank Richard. Thank you so much for your
Pleasure.
excellent presentation.
Thanks. Great as always. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I've learned a lot, you know, in this course of so many days of doing, you know, I love it, you know, and I have to always, you know, rewatch it because, you know, of the questions that we get in the beginning and because it's interesting, you know.
No worries. All right, I'll see you guys next week where we finish off the rest of the Abbasid history.
Yeah. Thank you. See you next
Okay.
week, guys. And see you Thursday, next whoever's coming Thursday. All right.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great job, Richard.